There were cops who thought they'd gotten away with it all. They'd taken bribes, covered up crimes, and manipulated the system for years. They were celebrating in the courtroom, thinking they were untouchable. But then, the judge announced, a shocking twist, the man they'd wronged, Jack Carter, was now their new boss. Suddenly, their world turned upside down. What happens next will shock you. Before we get into this remarkable story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. The police force had always been a place where corruption ran deep. Officers taking bribes, covering up crimes, and using their badges for personal gain had become the norm. A select group of cops thought they were untouchable, confident they could do whatever they wanted without facing any consequences. Their power was absolute, and they had been covering their tracks for years, manipulating the system to protect themselves. But there was one person they never expected to come back into the picture: Officer Jack Carter. He had been a no-nonsense, straight-arrow detective, known for his integrity and commitment to justice. Years ago, he had exposed one of his own officers for their corruption, and as a result, he was forced into hiding. The system was rigged, and Carter had become a target. But during his time away, he had been building something, an understanding of the corrupt world he was up against, gathering evidence and, slowly but surely, plotting his return. The corrupt cops thought they had gotten away with everything. They were celebrating in the courtroom, certain that the law would never catch up with them. But little did they know, the man they had wronged was back, and this time, he wasn't hiding. The courtroom was buzzing with tension. The corrupt officers, who had been running the show for years, sat comfortably in their seats, convinced that the trial would go their way. They had bribed, manipulated, and twisted the law to fit their needs. Today, they were expecting a slap on the wrist, if anything. The system was broken, and they were untouchable, or so they thought. Their smirks and whispers filled the air, but the moment the judge entered, the room fell silent. It was time for the verdict, and these cops were certain they'd walk free. They exchanged confident glances, thinking they had outsmarted everyone, including the public who had been demanding justice. They thought they had covered their tracks so well that no one could touch them. But what they didn't know was that the real shock was just about to begin. As the judge started reading the charges, the doors to the courtroom suddenly opened. The crowd, including the corrupt officers, turned to see who had entered. And then there he was, Officer Jack Carter, the very man they had wronged years ago, the man they had tried to silence, standing in the doorway. The officers froze. Their faces turned pale as Carter walked into the courtroom with an air of authority. The same man they had tried to destroy, the man they had never believed would come back, was standing in front of them. And he wasn't just here as a spectator. He wasn't here for revenge. He was here to take control. Carter made his way to the front of the courtroom, and the officers watched in disbelief. How could this be? They had thought Carter was gone for good. After all, he had exposed one of their own years ago, and they had pushed him out of the force. They had believed they'd won. But now, here he was, back, and he was in charge. Their past mistakes, their dirty deals, and their corruption were all about to be exposed, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The courtroom was dead. Silent as Carter spoke, his voice calm but filled with authority. "I'm not here to make a spectacle. I'm not here to gloat," he said, his gaze sweeping across the room, landing on each of the officers who had thought they were untouchable. "I'm here to let you know that the game has changed." A murmur ran through the courtroom as everyone tried to process what was happening. Jack Carter, the man they had wronged, was now in charge. The man who had been silenced and pushed out of the force for trying to do what was right was now their boss. The very same cops who had thought they had gotten away with it all now realized that their actions had finally caught up with them. Carter paused for a moment, letting the gravity of the situation sink in. The corrupt cops couldn't hide their shock. Some of them started to sweat. Others stared at the floor, unable to look Carter in the eye. They had underestimated him, thought he was out of the picture for good. But Carter had been working quietly, gathering evidence, building a case, and now he was in control. You all think you've gotten away with it. You think you can just cover things up, take bribes, and walk away scot-free. But today, that ends. I'm not here to settle scores. I'm here to clean up this department," Carter continued, his voice steady but filled with determination. "You've made this city unsafe. You've destroyed lives, and today, it all changes." The corrupt officers who had once controlled everything now sat at the mercy of the man they had wronged. They had no idea that Carter had been quietly gathering evidence all this time, secret recordings, witness statements, and paperwork that would bring their empire of corruption to its knees. They had been too busy celebrating, too arrogant to notice that the noose was tightening around their necks. Carter was now the head of internal affairs, the department responsible for overseeing all investigations within the force. He had full authority to investigate anyone, including those who had once been his colleagues. The very officers who had thought they were invincible were now the ones under scrutiny, and Carter was going to make sure they paid for every crime they had committed. The courtroom was filled with tension as Carter continued. "The corruption that has plagued this department for so long is about to be wiped out. I'm going to make sure every officer who has abused their power is held accountable, and there's nothing any of you can do to stop it." The officers who had once ruled the department with fear and manipulation were now the ones who were afraid. Their hands shook as they realized their fate was no longer in their own hands. They had underestimated Carter, thought he was out of the game for good, but now, as he stood before them, they realized that their reign of corruption was over. The man they had wronged was now in charge, and they would have to answer for their actions. The court was silent. The air was thick with tension as Carter's words sank in. The officers who had once controlled everything now knew that their world was about to come crashing down. The tables had turned, and they had no choice but to face the consequences of their past actions. Carter had won, and they were about to lose everything. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. Just moments ago, the corrupt cops had been celebrating their anticipated victory. They thought they had outsmarted everyone, convinced they'd gotten away with their crimes. The whispers among them grew louder as they exchanged smug glances, confident they were untouchable. But that confidence quickly evaporated when Officer Jack Carter stepped forward and began to speak. The once celebrating officers, now sitting in disbelief, could feel the tide turn against them. They had been so sure of their dominance, but now they were trapped. The smug expressions that had been plastered on their faces a few moments ago were replaced by unease. Some of the officers sat frozen, wide-eyed, unsure of what was happening. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting around the room, looking for a way out. A few began to whisper urgently to one another, trying to figure out how they could salvage the situation. But it was too late. Carter had already taken control of the room, and their past sins were about to come to light. "You thought you could get away with it, didn't you?" Carter's voice was calm, but there was a force behind it that made the corrupt officers tremble. "You thought that the law didn't apply to you, that you could do whatever you wanted without consequences." He looked at each officer in turn, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The once powerful men who had bullied others with their badges and manipulated the system to cover their tracks now found themselves on the other side of the law. They were no longer in control. The courtroom was dead silent, save for the low hum of nervous whispers from the officers. Carter didn't flinch. He had been preparing for this moment for years. He had been watching, gathering evidence, and building his case from the shadows. As each corrupt cop squirmed in their seat, Carter began revealing what they had hoped would remain hidden. He pulled out a folder, thick with documents and photos, and began to slowly go through the pages. One by one, he showed the room the damning evidence he had collected. The documents exposed their fraudulent activities: bribes, extortion, tampered evidence, and cover-ups. The pictures were even more damning: photos of officers shaking hands with criminals, smiling as they accepted bribes, photos of them framing innocent people for crimes they didn't commit. Carter didn't rush through it. He took his time, letting the officers see the evidence they couldn't deny. The courtroom was still, the weight of the truth sinking in. For the corrupt cops, it must have felt like the walls were closing in around them. The people they had wronged, the lives they had ruined, were now being put on display for everyone to see. They were no longer in control of the narrative. The first officer, Detective Daniels, who had always thought he was untouchable, suddenly blurted out, "This is all lies. You've got nothing on me." But Carter wasn't rattled. He simply showed another piece of evidence, a video recording of Daniels accepting a bribe from a known drug dealer. Daniels' face went pale as he tried to come up with an excuse, but there was nothing he could say. The evidence spoke for itself. One by one, the other cops started to realize the truth. They had been caught. They tried to cover up, to make excuses, but Carter wasn't having it. He had been steps ahead of them the entire time. They were the ones who had once been in charge, using their positions of power to get away with murder, but now they were facing the consequences of their actions. Officer Sullivan, one of the ringleaders of the corrupt group, stood up suddenly, his hands shaking as he made his way to the judge's bench. "Please," he begged, "you don't understand. We did what we had to do. You can't throw everything away. Think of what's at stake." But it was too late. Carter had all the leverage he needed. Sullivan was quickly escorted back to his seat, but the desperation in his eyes was obvious. The reality had set in. They were no longer in charge of the situation. The very thing they had feared was happening. Justice was catching up with them, and there was no escape. Carter paused for a moment, letting the weight of the situation sink in for the officers. He had them exactly where he wanted them. The corruption they had worked so hard to maintain was now exposed for all to see. The people they had harmed, the innocent lives they had ruined, Carter had gathered all the evidence, and now it was time for them to face the consequences. "Do you see now?" Carter asked, his voice cutting through the silence. "You've lived with this power thinking you could do anything, but today, you're no longer in control. Today, the truth has caught up with you." The room was buzzing with tension. The officers, now on the hot seat, the defense they had relied on, their ability to manipulate the system, had crumbled. Their smugness had evaporated, and all that was left was the undeniable truth that Carter had gathered over the years. The courtroom was a different place now. The corrupt cops who had once walked with their heads held high now sat slumped in their chairs, trying to make sense of what was happening. Their empire of lies was crumbling around them, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The game had changed. They were no longer the ones in power. Carter was the one in control now, and he wasn't going to let them get away with it. The once powerful group of corrupt officers that had held the city in a chokehold for years was now on the verge of collapse. The courtroom had been a turning point, but the true work was just beginning. Jack Carter had proven that justice could not be outrun. But now, as the head of internal affairs, it was his responsibility to clean up the department completely. And he wasn't about to back down. Carter wasted no time. He dove straight into the investigation, determined to ensure that every officer involved in corruption would face the consequences of their actions. He had already gathered a mountain of evidence, but now it was time to ensure that the entire department was held accountable, from the officers taking bribes to the higher-ups who had turned a blind eye. The truth had been revealed, and there would be no more hiding. The first step was to start with the officers themselves. Carter moved quickly, firing the officers who had been directly involved in criminal activities. He wasn't going to allow anyone to remain on the force who had corrupted the system. Each officer was given a chance to explain themselves, but their fate was sealed. There were no more chances for them to hide behind their badges. They had abused their power for too long, and now the full force of the law was coming for them. Detective Daniels, who had once been the most arrogant of the group, was the first to be arrested. The video evidence of his bribery dealings had sealed his fate. As Carter oversaw his arrest, Daniels begged for mercy, his once confident demeanor now completely shattered. He pleaded for a second chance, but Carter wasn't listening. He had seen firsthand how Daniels had abused his power and ruined lives. This wasn't about second chances. This was about justice. Sullivan, the ringleader of the group, was next. He tried to fight back, hoping that his connections would save him, but it was all in vain. Carter had done his homework, and Sullivan's past was full of shady deals, payoffs, and cover-ups. As the officers entered the police station in handcuffs, the once proud detectives who had run the show were now reduced to criminals facing the legal consequences of their actions. Sullivan's attempts to bribe officials fell on deaf ears. His time was up. But Carter didn't stop there. He understood that the corruption ran deeper than just the officers who had been caught. The entire department had been tainted. So Carter took on the task of cleaning up the system from top to bottom. He implemented new protocols, ensuring that the officers who remained on the force would never be able to act with impunity again. He created an internal watchdog group, made up of officers who were trustworthy, to ensure that any remaining corruption would be caught and rooted out. The department began to change, slowly but surely. Officers who had been afraid to speak up were now encouraged to report any wrongdoing. Carter's leadership was a breath of fresh air in a department that had been suffocating under the weight of corruption. He set up open lines of communication with the public, allowing citizens to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. He knew that the only way to truly fix the department was to make it transparent, to make it accountable to the people it was meant to serve. As the months went by, the changes became evident. The once corrupt officers were replaced with officers who had integrity, who weren't afraid to do what was right, even if it meant going against the grain. Carter didn't just clean up the department. He rebuilt it. He worked tirelessly to restore trust between law enforcement and the community. And slowly, the people of the city began to believe in the police force again. They saw Carter as the man who had taken back control, the man who had fought for what was right and who had made sure that justice was served. The trials continued for the remaining corrupt cops. They were arrested, tried, and convicted, one by one. Some received long prison sentences, while others faced significant fines or were forced to pay restitution to the victims they had wronged. There were no special deals for them, no backroom negotiations. Carter made sure that they faced the full weight of the law. They had abused their positions of power, and now they would pay the price. For the first time in years, the police department was truly serving the people. The corruption that had plagued the force was now gone, and those who had been responsible for it were either behind bars or out of the force completely. The department had been cleaned up, and Carter had proven that no matter how deep the corruption ran, the truth would always come to light. The system had been broken, but Carter had fixed it, piece by piece. In the end, Carter didn't just restore the department's integrity. He sent a message that echoed far beyond the walls of the courthouse. Corruption, no matter how high it goes, will always be exposed. There is no such thing as getting away with it forever. Justice may take time, but it always finds its way. Carter had won, not just for himself, but for the city he had sworn to protect. He had proven that with enough determination and courage, even the most corrupt systems could be torn down, and a new, better future could emerge. Justice has a funny way of showing up when you least expect it. You know, sometimes it feels like the bad guys get away with everything, bribes, corruption, and manipulation, while the good people are left to deal with the consequences. But when Jack Carter took charge, he turned the whole system upside down. Those corrupt cops who thought they were invincible, they ended up facing exactly what they deserved. It wasn't easy, but Carter made sure the truth came out, and the criminals got their just punishment. Have you ever seen someone get what they deserved, even when it seemed impossible? Maybe someone who had been hiding behind lies or taking advantage of others finally had to face the music? It's not always instant, and it doesn't always feel like it'll happen, but eventually, justice finds a way. For Carter, it was years of hard work and determination that led to that moment of triumph. Think about the times when you've seen a big turnaround like this. Maybe it's a time when the underdog stood tall, or when the truth was finally revealed, no matter how long it took. It's those moments that restore our faith in the system and remind us that even when it feels like the odds are against you, things can change. Tell me about your own experiences in the comments. Have you ever seen someone get justice when it felt like it would never happen? Let's talk about it. And if you want to hear more stories where the good guys come out on top, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the next story.